Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Joe Kelly. I am the program host with the Community Relations Department at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I would like to welcome you all to tonight's program, tonight's Smart Towns program, An Echo Amid the Oaks, the story of Calvin Greene, with presenter Dean Masters, who's a member of the Thoreau Society and a staff member of the Kresge Library at Oakland University. First off, we would like to thank the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library for funding our many programs with their many fundraisers. We greatly appreciate their support. And to find out more about Smart Towns programs, which is a community partnership to support lifelong learners, please visit smarttowns.rhpl.org. Join us on Tuesday, February 9th at 7 p.m. for our next program, which will be the Soul Center Mindset Workshop with life coach Courtney Jones. Tonight's program, we will have folks muted throughout the program, and you can feel free to leave questions in the chat. Towards the end of the program, we will take a short time to have Q&As. I'll present questions, and our presenters will answer them to the best of their ability. The program tonight will be recorded. It will also be available to view about 1 week from tonight, and that should be shared with you and available to share with whoever's interested. So that's enough intro, and for now, I will go ahead and pass it off to our presenter. So everyone, please welcome Dean Masters. Dean, take it away.
Thanks, Joe. So let me start by saying thank you to Tiffany and Joe and to the Rochester Hills Public Library and the Smart Towns program for having me. And thank you everyone for joining tonight. It's it's strange doing things online, but it's wonderful that people can attend from all over. And you don't have to drive through the snow if you're from southeastern Michigan tonight. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to share this story with you tonight. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you all. And please let us know if you have any trouble seeing this presentation or hearing the audio. Let me reconfigure things here. Okay. So the Smart Town series is about resilience and renewal and the ingenuity of the human spirit. And there will be many examples of that throughout the story tonight. From persevering in the loss of loved ones to the way that good books and conversation can make us feel close to each other even when we're physically distant, to the ways in which imagination and curiosity and wonder can sustain us and inspire us to be better people. For the last year and a half, I've been visiting the southwest corner of Avon and Livernois roads in Oakland County in southeastern Michigan, about a mile from the city of Rochester. It's become a sacred place to me. The Clinton River flows through there, and in warmer weather, I come down to its banks with books by Henry David Thoreau to read and think. Today, the place is called the Avon Nature Study Area, an overlooked corner of Rochester that preserves a wealth of natural beauty against the changes of time all around it. Despite the encroachment of human development, it offers a refuge, a place to observe plants and wildlife, a place to gather one's thoughts. And while I'm there, I imagine that I hear the echo of music that's now 150 years gone. The echo of a flute played by a man who once owned a saw and cider mill at this place, a man named Calvin Harlow Greene. So who is Greene? He's mostly only remembered today by a few history buffs in the Rochester area and by a small number of scholars of the writer and naturalist Henry David Thoreau. Because in the 1850s, Greene exchanged letters with Thoreau and asked him to have a picture of himself made, which resulted in the now famous daguerreotype, the image that you may have seen when registering for this talk, one of only 2 photographic likenesses that we have of Thoreau. Calvin Greene was also one of the earliest American literary pilgrims, traveling both in 1863 and 1874 to the town of Concord, where Thoreau spent nearly all his life. Calvin Greene was a reader, a thinker, and a lifelong learner, though his abilities were often underestimated by those who didn't know him well. To keep up in the larger world of literature, he had an impressive array of periodicals that were being sent to him in Rochester from all over the place. He was subscribed to the Boston Liberator and the New York Tribune, the New York Truth Seeker, the Atlantic Monthly, the Concord Monitor, the Radical, and many, many more.
Hey, Dean, sorry to interrupt. Could I ask you to speak maybe a little closer to the microphone or speak up just
Absolutely.
a little bit? A couple of folks are just having a hard time hearing.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Sure. In addition to this, he amassed a library of books and then shared those books liberally with friends and neighbors. His house became the site of literary gatherings in Rochester, and he had a big influence on people in the town. He worked as a farmer, a mill operator, a teacher, a principal, a furniture dealer, a painter, and perhaps many more things, but he somehow always found time to dedicate to reading his books and writing his voluminous correspondence. He was professedly a nobody, and he preferred he not be given much attention, but it's that humility that makes him even more interesting to me. Tonight, I hope to give some glimpses into his life and to resurrect the memory of this man who represents literary culture in early Rochester. I'll start by talking about his family and his education. I'll read some excerpts from his correspondence with Thoreau and some from letters between he and his brother, which show how Thoreau's writing helped build a bridge between two estranged family members in a time of crisis. I'll give glimpses from Greene's diary into the two journeys he made to Concord, and I'll try to show the impression that Greene left on friends and neighbors who knew him well. And finally, I'll talk about some of Greene's legacy that can still be felt today. So the year 1817 is a significant one for Greene's story. In that year, Henry David Thoreau was born. Calvin Harlow Greene himself was born. The town that Greene was born in, Covington, New York, was founded that year, and the first settlers arrived in Rochester, Michigan, and built a house near what is today East 3rd and Main Street. A plaque marks the spot of the site today, and it's very close to a spot where Greene would live during the final years of his life. Greene's parents were Lazarus Greene, a shaker from Massachusetts, and Mary Phillips of Vermont. Note that there isn't much consistency in the way the name Greene is spelled, sometimes like the color, sometimes with an additional E, although it seems that Calvin and his brothers were the first generation to start adding the letter E. Calvin had one older brother, James Harvey, or sometimes Herbie, born in 1813 in New York. Calvin followed in 1817. The mother, the father, and the two boys traveled west from New York and likely stayed for a time in Union Village, Ohio, which was the first Shaker settlement west of the Alleghenies. In Ohio, their third son, Harbord, was born. Lazarus Greene purchased land in Washington, Michigan, a town about 6 miles northeast of Rochester, and their family gravestone today in Washington Center Cemetery reads Pioneers of 1822. They first settled at what is today the southwest corner of 28 Mile Road in Campground. Lazarus was an arborist, and hundreds of orchards in the surrounding counties began from trees that he brought with him from New York. In 1839, Calvin and his brother James joined the Rochester Congregational Church, and the two brothers traveled to Oberlin Collegiate Institute in Ohio to study for the ministry. Oberlin had a reputation for being progressive. It admitted students regardless of skin color or gender. African American students began attending in 1835 and women in 1837. And in the first half of the 19th century, the school became known as a hotbed of abolitionism. Calvin Greene and his father were both outspoken abolitionists as well. When Lazarus Greene died in 1847 while visiting his brother in Ohio, his obituary was run in an abolitionist newspaper from Ann Arbor called the Signal of Liberty, in which it called Lazarus a warm friend of the slave and an earnest advocate of human rights. When Calvin Greene himself died, his obituary read, "He was an abolitionist when it was considered a disgrace to be one." Calvin Greene seems to have loved the atmosphere and the politics of Oberlin, but he had doubts about going into the ministry. So while James went on to graduate from the school in 1841, he came back to Michigan after just one term in the spring of 1840. As he would later put it, they wanted to make a preacher of me. Gracious, I had a narrow escape. So on September 8th, 1849, Calvin Greene was married to Esther Elizabeth Burbank, the daughter of William Burbank and Olive Hamlin Burbank. pioneers of Rochester. Fidelia Gillette, writing in the Rochester-era newspaper, once claimed that it was Olive herself who named the town of Rochester, Michigan, after her friends, the Rochester family in Rochester, New York. The Greene's first child was Horace Harlow Greene, born in 1843, and their second son, William Harvey Greene, came in 1847. The same year that this second child was born, Greene's father died, and 2 years later his mother passed away as well. Then in 1850, Greene's younger brother Harbert was swept up in the westward rush to California for gold. The same fall that his younger brother left in 1850, the Greene's third son, Benjamin Herbert Greene, was born. Now, Greene was continuing this H-name tradition that his parents had started, so he and his brothers were Harvey, Harlow, and Harbert, and his own sons would be Harlow, Harvey, and Herbert. Yet it seems that the third child actually went by the name Benny instead of Herbert, and unfortunately we know this because the youngest boy died beginning of 1853 at the age of 2. As he was dying, his grandmother, Olive Burbank, was beside him singing hymns. He was buried in the Mount Avon Cemetery in Rochester, a small white rounded stone with just that word, Benny. The following winter, Greene also lost his older brother, James Hervey, at the age of 40. So now his younger brother was off in California seeking gold. Who knew if he'd ever come back? Now Greene had lost both of his parents, his older brother, and his own child. It was in the wake of these tragedies that he first came upon the works of Henry David Thoreau. He saw an advertisement for Walden in Horace Greeley's New York Tribune in July 1854, a month before the book's publication. And after reading the excerpts that were in that article, he wrote to the publisher in Boston requesting a copy. That winter, Greene read Thoreau for the first time, enthusiastically, ecstatically even. Esther Greene was now pregnant with another child. It does not seem a coincidence that this new child was to be named Henry, not only because it was another H name, but because it was the name of Greene's new favorite author. Henry Wilson Greene was born February 15, 1855. But again, tragedy visited the Greene home. Henry died on October 13th that same year, 2 days shy of 8 months old. Now, a second small rounded tombstone was placed beside Benny's, this one reading simply, Henry. The winter after his son's death, Greene picked up his copy of Walden again. It was a book that offered him consolation, inspiration, and a feeling of kinship with another mind. He'd annotated it, he'd underlined it, he'd cross-referenced passages. And now he saw that on one of his pages, Thoreau had this earlier book called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. So he wrote to obtain a copy of that book, but instead he was given Thoreau's home address. The only way to obtain a copy of that book was to purchase one from Thoreau. For Thoreau had 700 copies collected in his father's attic. We've long known about Thoreau's letters to Greene, but it wasn't until very recently that Greene's letters to Thoreau have turned up. Some of them were just published for the first time in 2018 in Princeton University's The Writings of Henry Thoreau, The Correspondence, Volume 2. And the remainder of Greene's letters are forthcoming in Volume 3 of that series. I'm grateful to Dr. Robert Hudspeth for sharing the transcript of those forthcoming letters and to the private owner for allowing me to show some images of them tonight. Before we look at those letters, though, I want to set some context of Thoreau's reputation during this time. So in the 1850s and 60s, Thoreau was not a well-published author. He wasn't an American icon. People weren't making trips to Walden Pond and assigning his books to class syllabi and devoting academic articles and even whole journals to his life and his works. Thoreau made this deal when publishing his first book that he would buy back whatever didn't sell from an imprint of 1,000. So 4 years later, he receives 706 unsold copies, the vast majority of which hadn't even been bound yet. It prompted him to write, I have now a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself. While his second book, Walden, sold better, neither were sensations, and sales of both didn't indicate the kind of figure that we know today. Thoreau was still relatively unknown even after his death, and for a period in scholarship he was viewed as nothing more than a disciple of Ralph Waldo Emerson. All this to say that when Calvin Greene first decided to write to Thoreau in 1856, he was not a star-struck fan writing to any kind of a celebrity. He was just a man who had felt a deep intellectual and spiritual connection with another through reading, and he hoped to turn that into a friendship. Greene saw something in Thoreau that most others at the time did not. Dear Sir, Greene wrote in January of 1856, a year ago last summer, I saw a notice in the New York Tribune of your work then in press, Walden, or Life in the Woods, with some extracts of the same. It took with me, have read and reread it with an interest I have not time to describe, and so on. Thoreau replied, I'm glad to hear that my Walden has interested you, that perchance it holds some truth still as far off as Michigan. And he offered to sell him a copy of the earlier book for $1.25. Greene's next letter overflows with enthusiasm. He sends the $1.25 for the earlier book. He asks how Walden is being received, and he conjectures that in order for it to be really appreciated, 75 to 100 years would have to pass. He tells Thoreau about reviews he's read in different places and things that others in Rochester have said who he's enthusiastically shown the book to. He talks about some of his own favorite passages, including the part of Walden where Thoreau mentions losing a hound, a bay horse, and a turtle dove, which was a passage that brought Greene to tears, for he felt as if he'd been searching for a lost turtle dove for some time now. Greene writes, I claim to have been acquainted with the author of Walden now some year and a half. I have been with him in the house, among the beans, on the hills, across the lake, through the woods and farms. At times accompanied him with my flute. I flute a little. And I thought we courted, usually. Oh, I have had a sort of longing for some time to see the author of Walden. I wanted to take him by the hand. He goes on to call Walden Pond a good place to study for a profession, particularly that of theology. Thoreau sent a copy of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers to Greene. And in his next letter, he writes, I thank you heartily for your expression of interest in Walden, and I hope you will not be disappointed by the week. As for how Walden was selling, Thoreau says it's doing well, but I should consider it a greater success to interest one wise and earnest soul than a million unwise and frivolous. In response to Greene's longing to see and take the author of Walden by the hand, he says, you may rely on it that you have the best of me in my books, and that I am not worth seeing personally, the stuttering, blundering clodhopper that I am. In the same letter comes the passage I find most endearing as someone who's lived in Oakland County most of my life. Thoreau says, I like the name of your county. May it grow men as sturdy as its trees. Methinks I hear your flute echo amid the oaks. Is not yours, too, a good place to study theology? I hope that you will, ere long, recover your turtle dove, and that it will bring you glad tidings out of that heaven in which it disappeared. Greene goes on to buy another copy of A Week from Thoreau, this one for his brother-in-law, the Rochester merchant James Newberry, and he invites Thoreau to come visit Rochester. Thoreau is appreciative, but says that he doesn't foresee a trip west anytime soon. Then in his next letter, Greene sends $5, and he requests an additional copy of each of Thoreau's two books to be sent to his younger brother, Harbert, who you'll remember was in California as part of the gold rush. And additionally, he wonders whether Thoreau might have a picture of himself made. And then keep the change. So Thoreau sent the two books to Harbert Greene in California. And 6 days later, on June 18th, 1856, he was in Worcester, Massachusetts, visiting his friends Blake and Brown when he visited the daguerrean palace of Benjamin D. Maxim and had 3 very similar daguerreotypes made, a common custom at the time. One of them he gave to his friend Blake, a second to Brown, and the third he mailed to Greene. While in Worcester this week, I obtained the accompanying daguerreotype, he writes, which my friends think is pretty good, though better looking than I. This is the daguerreotype in its original casing, as it is on display today in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. In Greene's next letter, he thanks Thoreau for the picture, and he adds, "Oh, I love those works. I love their author. Why is he so often present in my night visions and in my daydreams? Why?" Perhaps this was a bit too familiar for the sometimes reserved Thoreau, especially coming from a stranger from so far away. In any case, Thoreau did not reply at the time. Now, the seeds of Thoreau's thoughts had flown on the wind across the country. One of those seeds had landed in Rochester, Michigan, but another had made its way all the way to California, to a lonely young man. Harbert Greene had been in California for 6 years now, wandering restlessly. He was going back and forth across the state, working in mines, selling drugs as a physician's assistant, trying to find his way back to Michigan. Thoreau's books were a fresh breeze that blew from home, easing that homesickness. He called the books an oasis to the traveler in the desert. And of Thoreau's words, he says, "I think I have really heard them, and I am trying to understand them." His works are characterized by a rare vigor and fertility of thought and an independence withal that I much admire. Though he says Thoreau is occasionally difficult for someone of his own ability to follow, by the blazes on the trees, I managed to make some progress. Harvard's letters to his brother even begin to sound something like Thoreau themselves. "Our real neighbors are the oak and the pine," he writes, "always at home, firm and independent, and although they cannot speak, their silence is more impressive and instructive than the voluble twaddle of society. Here, we are not troubled by arbitrary fashions. Our neighbors' styles of dress are as they were a century ago. Yet in all my rambles, have never heard that they ever sought or sighed for a change." Harbert admits when he first saw this package of books being sent to him on behalf of his brother, he thought they must have been religious books. For the two older brothers, James and Calvin, had both been Oberlin students bound for the ministry, and apparently Harbert had always felt left out of that calling. "Many years ago, I lost 2 only brothers," he writes. "Lonely and sad, I have since wandered about, vainly seeking some substitute. Have been shown a stupendous, but to me, foundationless edifice where they entered," this being probably a reference to the church. "Have had occasional glimpses of them through its portals, but always have been at an unapproachable distance. During a few months past," he goes on, "have sometimes thought that though death has removed one of them in 1854 from the stage of life, possibly I may live to draw near unto the other, and this desolate heart yet finds solace in reciprocal fraternal affection." Harbert had lost both of his parents. He felt alienated from both of his brothers. He was without a family of his own, and now he was lost in California, wishing he could come back, but not having the means to do so. Thoreau's books consoled him, and finally they became a kind of touchstone between the two brothers. Its words became a kind of secret language they could share to talk about personal issues. For instance, when Harbert, the agnostic, began cautiously to ask his brother about his current religious views, he asked Calvin to read specific pages of Thoreau's A Week, pages 69 to 79 of that first edition, where Thoreau talks most explicitly about religion, and to respond if that's how he feels too. So Thoreau's book provided a channel through which they could draw closer and talk about the difficult things that separated them. When he learned that Greene was on literally the same page as him regarding agnosticism, Harbert wrote, "Language is inadequate to express my joy." And then he shared his own views as well. "If I ever feel as if I was drawing nigh unto God, it is when I am alone in the forest. If I never find him there, I need not seek his presence in churches." Calvin Greene read and reread his brother's letters from California many times, saving more than 70 of them for the rest of his life, and all the friends and family members he showed them to always wanted to see them published. In Greene's next letter to Thoreau, he shares lines from Ossian's Caricatura, sort of a mystical poem. "They stood in silence in their beauty, like 2 young trees of the plain, when a shower of spring is on their leaves and the loud winds are laid." He insists in this letter that he has no intention of flattering Thoreau, and he adds that Thoreau's books have been fine companions on a tramp in our Michigan woods. "They sometimes remind me of some heroic and golden dream of my boyhood days." He says he's still hoping to see Thoreau, but assumes that he has not been west. And Thoreau replies, "You're right, and supposing I have not been westward, I'm very little of a traveler. I'm gratified to hear the interest you take in my books. It's additional encouragement to write more of them. Though my pen is not idle, I have not published anything for a couple of years at least. I like a private life and cannot bear to have the public in my mind." While Thoreau may not have been publishing at this time, he was keeping very ardently a journal that ended up being 2 million words long. "You'll excuse me for not responding more heartily to your notes," he goes on, "since I realize what an interval there always is between the actual and imagined author, and feel that it would not be just for me to appropriate the sympathy and goodwill of my unseen readers. Nevertheless, I should like to meet you, and if ever I come into your neighborhood, shall endeavor to do so. Can't you tell the world of your life also? Then I shall know you, at least as well as you me." But Greene was having none of this. "Now, sir, that did not sound cool to me," he writes. "I did not believe it. Yet to a certain extent I must cordially accept it. Some author has said, among other things, that literature must be explained from individual history, or must remain words. Again, the true poet is the poet's mind. In the man, could we lay him open, we should see the last flourish and tendril of his work, as every spine and tint in the seashell pre-exist in the secreting organs of the fish. If Emerson is right, I am." Still, he apologizes to Thoreau somewhat for being so forward, and still insists it would be wonderful to have Thoreau visit. Greene was working as a teacher at this time at the Avon Lyceum, the high school in Rochester, and he says, "Some of the members of the Young Men's Lyceum of this village, having become somewhat acquainted with you through your writings, would be very glad if the society was able to obtain your services in coming and delivering before it a course of lectures this winter and spring." Then in his postscript, Greene adds, "You inquire if I cannot give the world my life also. I answer, I cannot, and I can." I often wonder what it would have been like if Greene had set out to write his own world, and what did he see in the woods and fields and streams of Oakland County? In October 1859, Greene was following the news about John Brown, a man that he emphatically believed was a hero. The attack on Harper's Ferry Federal Arsenal came October 16th to 18th, and Greene was following the news. At the beginning of November, Thoreau gave a speech called "The Character and Actions of Captain John Brown." Now, when Greene learned about this lecture, he wrote to Thoreau asking if he could get a copy of it. And Thoreau replied he didn't have copies of the lecture himself, and various newspapers had only printed it in part. But he adds that he's grateful for Greene's interest in them. He says he tried hard to get pamphlets printed and sold for Brown's family, but to no avail, for publishers were afraid to print anything about it. Thoreau closes by saying, "I shall be glad to see you if I ever come your way," and that was the last exchange of letters between the two of them. Tragedy once more visited the Greene household at the beginning of 1860, when on February 6th, Calvin Greene's oldest child, Horace Harlow Greene, died at the age of 16. And so Harlow was buried beside his two brothers, Benny and Henry, in the Mount Avon Cemetery. This must have been an utter shock to Calvin and Esther, and to their only remaining boy, William Harvey, who was now 13. The following year, Harbert Greene finally returned to Michigan from California. One likes to believe that he and Calvin were able to attain that level of intimate friendship that Greene apparently longed for. However, the records are silent. A year after his return, Harbert married a woman named Rhoda Galpin and tried to start a farm near Traverse City. Unfortunately, over the next 8 years, his mental health deteriorated, and he was finally committed to the Kalamazoo Asylum for the Insane, where he died in 1869 at the age of 50. His name on the family tomb has since been knocked out, as you can see here. There's only one piece that apparently remains, which was tucked inside. And you can also see Calvin Harlow Greene's name written on the monument above, but that's, I believe, just a placeholder to show that Calvin was part of the family, for we know that he and his wife were actually buried in Rochester. In the spring of 1861, Henry Thoreau's health was rapidly declining. He was suffering from tuberculosis, and it was recommended he travel to improve his health. So he decided on the tour of the Great Lakes region. In May, he wrote a letter to Emerson, including a list of names of those he might meet on his trip west, and Greene was not on the list. He traveled with a man named Horace Mann Jr., and they set out on May 12th. And then on May 21st, Thoreau took the train from Detroit to Chicago, having passed within just miles of Rochester, where Calvin Greene lived. He never made a visit, and he never told Greene he was passing through. So why didn't Thoreau visit? Well, perhaps he was put off by the intensity of Greene's very familiar letters, being a stranger from so far away. Perhaps he felt the relationship was too one-sided. Greene was always asking him for things, a daguerreotype and copies of books, and not providing anything in return. Perhaps it was just Henry's poor health. He was limiting the amount of visits that he would have while he traveled. Perhaps he simply forgot. Corinne Osfield Smith has written a fantastic book on Thoreau's final journey. It's not only the story of Henry's trip, but it's her own story as she retraces his steps, and it's written in a wonderfully conversational way. You can see chapter 7 especially for one of the best versions of Greene's story that's out there. So Thoreau died on May 6, 1862. Greene first learned of Thoreau's death from some of the periodicals he was reading, and his response was to take a long walk in our Michigan country, over the hills, through the fields and woods, scenery which that raw genius has so associated himself to me. And he thought to himself, Pan is dead, nature ailing throughout indeed. He decided to write to Franklin Sanborn in Concord, and in a part of that letter he confessed a plan he was hatching to head east. For some time past, he greatly desired to make a sort of pilgrimage to good old New England on foot, taking in your place in the trip, he says. Sanborn encouraged this trip, and he also passed along to Greene the greetings of Thoreau's mother and sister, Cynthia and Sophia, who surprisingly remembered Greene's letters fondly. And so Greene wrote to Thoreau's sister, and he told Sophia about a gift that he'd wanted to send Thoreau as a token of his esteem, but now he'd missed his chance. When Sophia told Greene that the companion that so often mentioned in Thoreau's works was most often Ellery Channing, Greene decided to give it to him. The gift was a cane crafted in California, made of manzanita wood with a buffalo horn handle. Silver mountings on it were engraved with a quote that said, "Love equals swift and slow and high and low," part of a poem of Thoreau's from his section on friendship in his first book. Sophia wrote back to him, thanking him, adding she was impressed by Calvin Greene's spirit of rare contentment that she sensed in his letters. She encouraged him multiple times to come visit Concord. "It would afford us pleasure to see you at any time," she says, "and I trust that you may be attracted to this neighborhood." And then she writes to another of Thoreau's friends, Daniel Ricketson, about the cane. "Was not this a rare instance of friendship?" she said. "How dear Henry would have enjoyed receiving the gift. Perhaps he knows all about it now." So in September 1863, Greene set out on his first pilgrimage to Concord and Walden. As far as I know, he was only the second person to do so in honor of Thoreau who was not from that area. This was long before there was a tourism culture at Walden. It was still years before even anyone was laying rocks on the cairn that's become a tourist tradition when visiting Walden Pond. Greene would be one of the first of many, many pilgrims who've repeated the same journey over the nearly 160 years since Thoreau's death. The photo in the background here is a picture I took when I made my own pilgrimage to Walden Pond. So this is what it looks like about 6 years ago. Greene arrived on September 1st and rented a room at the Middlesex Hotel in the center of town. In the open square near the hotel, he saw soldiers being mustered into service and encamped. It was wartime. Greene's first stop in Concord was a bookstore where he bought a copy of the Boston Commonwealth, and he found on the first page a poem of Thoreau's that was new to him called The Departure, and he took that as a personal welcome to the town. Concord reminded him of Oberlin 20 years ago. Orderly, staid. He felt content there. The next day he headed to Walden Woods, and he found the site of Thoreau's bean field and the place where Thoreau's cabin had been. And he located it pretty accurately by bringing along his copy of Walden and just carefully reading and measuring out the area. Later that day, he stopped to see Thoreau's sister and mother, and they both immediately insisted he get his things from the hotel and come stay with them. and that night Thoreau's mother reminisced about Henry Thoreau's final days. It's from that talk we learned one version of the final words of Thoreau. Sophia and Cynthia told Greene, as Thoreau was dying, he asked to be read passages from his first book. And at the end of one of those reading sessions, he smiled and said quietly, "Now comes smooth sailing." Greene was so full of thoughts that night he had trouble sleeping. In the morning, he went with Sophia and met Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. Louisa wouldn't come out to meet a guest, however. Greene writes in his diary she had just come home sick from the Army hospital at Washington and had lost part of her hair, which she claimed she laid upon the altar of her country. In the afternoon, he met with Ellery Channing, who he'd sent the cane to, and they went for a walk along the Concord River, where Channing said that he and Thoreau used to bathe. Channing jumped into the water, and Greene sat on the bank and wrote notes in his journal. And then they went down to Walden Pond. Channing stopped to show Greene this patch of American view that Thoreau was fond of and didn't show to many people. On the way back north, they stopped at Brister's Spring, where Greene lay down on the ground and took a good cold drink of water in the memory of Thoreau. So he spent the rest of his time in Concord going on walks with Ellery Channing and Sophia Thoreau. They visited neighbors and literary luminaries of Concord. He paid tribute at Thoreau's grave. He visited Walden Pond at night and took a bath in it. He revisited that patch of view that Thoreau was fond of. He strolled out to Emerson's Cliff. He talked with the Thoreaus through the evening. On his hikes, he was thinking to himself, he probably crossed and recrossed Thoreau's path so many times by now. And then he found the place where Thoreau's cabin now resided, a few miles north of Walden Pond, and he took a broken shingle from it as a memento. He met others like Elizabeth Peabody, who talked passionately with him about Margaret Fuller. He visited Ralph Waldo Emerson, who asked him about Michigan University and whether the young men of the West were not, some of them at least, seeking for more light and truth. On one of his hikes, Greene found this branch on a young maple tree that had already turned fiery red, even though it was early September, and he broke part of it off when he brought it back to the Thoreau house, and he tossed it up into this evergreen tree facing one of the house's windows, and it caught Thoreau's mother's eye. And Cynthia sat there wondering what it meant. And so when Greene told her, "Oh, I did that," she exclaimed, "Now there, that was just like my son Henry." And that was perhaps the highest compliment Thoreau's mother could have paid Calvin Greene. When it was time to go back home at the end of the trip, it was a tender leave-taking, and Sophia Thoreau was in tears. Now, Greene's love for the authors he read influenced his friends and neighbors in Rochester, too. It seems clear to me he shared his Thoreau books and the daguerreotype with the writer, preacher, and suffragist Reverend Fidelia Woolley Gillette. I mentioned earlier a story that Gillette wrote that gave one version of the naming of Rochester. In that same story, Calvin Greene himself appears. I believe she was probably a close family friend of the Greenes during her time living in Rochester. I believe it's possible that Calvin Greene also gave a copy of a poem that she wrote to Sophia Thoreau. For this poem appears in her scrapbook dated 1863, and it's titled Henry D. Thoreau. It was later published in her Gillette's own book in 1879, Pebbles from the Shore. I'm going to read a few lines from the opening of the poem. When I read this poem, I like to imagine Calvin Greene and Fidelia sharing Thoreau's books and picture and having conversations about their impressions of it near the banks of the Clinton River. Not till this very June's sweet roses bloomed, and all the woods were full of thy dear friends, the flowers. And down before my door the Clinton sung its summer song. Did I look in upon thy life to find that thou hadst dwelt so near the pure perennial spring, whose waters are with bending rainbows arched forever. How in thy heart was sweet of bud and bloom of flower, and song of birds and ripple of the brooks, murmurs of the summer breeze, and sounds of wintry winds, and green of meadow and of lawn, and strength of rock, and gentleness of vine, and glow of moonshine and of sun, until thou were as much great nature's child as thou wert ere thy mother's. But all these summer days I've gazed upon thy pictured face and have been learning thee. And when from hours of toil and pain I have come back, and lingered at thy side, I felt my weariness all gone, and thrills of joy for heavy sobs of pain. I like to think about those words. I've gazed upon thy pictured face and have been learning thee. And seems like me. It seems like a reference to the daguerreotype to me. Later in the same poem, she also makes a reference to the turtle dove passage of Walden that Greene loved so much. The life of Fidelia Gillette is just another wonderful story. There's not time to tell here, but I will add that author and historian Maureen Thalman is currently at work on a book that will be titled, I Love Because I Must, The Life of the Reverend Fidelia Gillette, which should be published in the spring of 2021. So Greene had purchased Thoreau's first book, and he loved it at a time when it was mostly overlooked. And apparently he did the same thing for another 19th century nature writer before he became famous as well, John Burroughs. In 1868, he wrote to Burroughs a letter of appreciation for his first book, published the year before, Notes on Walt Whitman as a Poet and Person, which Greene had learned about in one of his periodicals, and they maintained a short correspondence as well. In 1867, Greene began purchasing land at the southwest corner of Avon and Livernois roads, where there was a mill. It was used by him as a cider and sawmill, and when he took it over, it became known for a long time after as Greene's Mill. You can see on this plat map from 1872, the corner of Avon, which is running east-west, and Livernois, which is running north-south. On the southwest corner here where it says S. Mill and C.H. Greene. I believe that at one time Greene was using the combined power of two creeks that flowed into the Clinton to power the mill. It's also reported in the Rochester Era newspaper that between Greene's Mill and the Perrin property to the northeast here was an Indian burial ground on the brow of the hill. Now the roads have since been reconstructed to make a more perfect T-shape, so that burial ground is now likely underneath the intersection of the roads. The same year that this map was printed, the railroad came to Rochester. You can see that it says proposed along the railroad track here, and it came right near Greene's house. The tracks have been recently removed, and the pathway has been converted into the Clinton River Trail. So if you visit this area today, you can walk the path between downtown Rochester and Greene's old mill property. It's about a mile, and it's a beautiful walk. The same year as the train came to Rochester, in 1872, the Rochester Literary Society was formed. Fidelia Gillette was a founding member and a lecturer in the inaugural program. And the Greenes participated in that, and at least once the society met at their house here at the mill. One likes to think the Greenes' quickly growing library became useful to the group. The following year, in 1873, an Ann Arbor newspaper printed an article by L.D. Birch, which was about Greene. A mile to the westward of the village, Harlow Greene has a sawmill and cider mill combined with ample power from the Clinton River. He's doing a fine business. Mr. Greene is a man of divided affections. His model mill has never quite blunted his poetic tastes. In a pleasant little home across the river, the literary and social atmosphere is charming enough to attract the gods. Here dwells a man of simple tastes and habits, daily joining the rough life of the lumbermen to tenderest communion with Emerson, Parker, Curtis, and Hawthorne. He is a passionate lover of Henry Thoreau and Margaret Fuller. At the homes of these living authors, he is a welcome visitor. At the graves of the dead ones, a reverent pilgrim. An ardent and sympathetic student of nature, Harlow Greene lives here in modest estate on the banks of the beautiful river, quite near to his God and near enough to his fellow men to make up our ideal of the Christian man. There's a little bit of irony in that, considering that Harlow always listed himself as an agnostic. But in the spring of 1874, Greene was missing Concord and wished to come again. He sent this volume of poems to Sophia Thoreau, and he wrote to her he was still seeing her brother in his dreams. So Sophia invited him to come back to Concord. Though this time she wouldn't see him, she was packing to move to Maine, and her mother Cynthia had died the year before. But nevertheless, at the end of that summer, in August, Greene made his second pilgrimage. He came to stay at the Middlesex Hotel again. He dropped off his things and immediately went for Walden Pond. And he stopped on the way at Rister's Spring, which was a sacred fountain, he said. He lay down on the ground and drank 7 swallows of its pure water. He walked to the site where Thoreau's cabin had once been, and he sat down and he wrote in his journal, reflecting on what a major influence the book Walden had been on his life. The cabin is gone, he wrote, long since moved away, but thank God we can't move away this foundation, nor the attendant memories. Again, of course, this is a contemporary picture of the site of Thoreau's hut in Cairns, as we know it today. Many changes had occurred in Concord since his last visit. Now there were picnic grounds near the pond. The Baker farm had disappeared, and even Thoreau's grave had moved. His sister Sophia had it moved to the Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Where Greene had seen soldiers encamped outside his hotel the last time he was here, now there was a monument to remember the lives of those same soldiers that had been laid down in battle. This is a grand old town, Greene wrote in his journal. Over the next week, he visited and walked with Channing and Sanborn again, but he declined to see Emerson because the sage of Concord was in such poor health. He visited the Alcott's house twice more, and while he still didn't meet Louisa May Alcott, for she was away from home, this time the youngest daughter, May, was there. She's the basis for Amy and Little Women. She was selling her paintings for money to make a third trip to Europe, and Greene wanted to buy one, but he found $25 to be more than he could afford. Bronson Alcott recorded this visit in his own journal, and he referred to Calvin Greene as a plain, thoughtful man of liberal views and of Thoreau's type of mind. A lumber dealer, I infer from his speaking of his mill, and has the manners of a pioneer. He urges me to take Rochester on my way westwards and visit his neighbors for conversation generally. On his last day in Concord, Greene set out for one last visit to Walden Pond. I shall probably not see it again, he wrote. Here I now sit with my back against a little pine sapling, now growing on the site where the hut once stood. And before me, a few feet away, is a small but gradually increasing pile of stone, to which each friend of Mr. T visiting here is expected to add his unit. I brought one up from the pond as my contribution with the word Bethel penciled on it, a word which means literally house of God. He closed his journal and he left the woods for the last time. As he got on the train out of Concord, he told Ellery Channing this would be his last visit. He should not be here again. And Channing replied, "Oh, yes, you will." In 1880, Greene moved to a house on East 3rd and Main in Rochester. The same year, he ran for superintendent of Rochester schools. He was a regular writer to his favorite periodicals, including The Truth Seeker of New York. In the early 1880s, he spoke and wrote about the history of schools in Rochester and Washington. He helped his son Harvey run a furniture and undertaking business in downtown Rochester, taking over the business for short periods while Harvey was away. The Greenes had 311 South Main Street built for this business, a place which still stands today and currently houses Haig's Jewelry. Greene's son Harvey married Carrie Roberts, the daughter of Hiram Roberts and Mary Beagle Roberts of Rochester, and they had a daughter named Marjorie. This was Greene's only grandchild whom he doted on. Through Marjorie, there are still many descendants of Calvin Greene alive today. So how do we know anything about Greene? In April 1897, Samuel Arthur Jones, a medical doctor and one-time professor and dean at the University of Michigan, who was living in Ann Arbor, managed to get in touch with Greene. Jones was a collector of Thoreau and other writers, and he began writing letters to those who knew Thoreau in life, serving as one of the biggest forces in shaping Thoreau's reputation into what we know today. Jones and Greene maintained a correspondence for the next year and a half, and it's the most valuable glimpse that we still have into the life of Calvin Greene. Jones came to Rochester in May 1897, and he and Calvin Greene climbed up a hill of pines in Rochester and had a good, long, rambling talk. Greene decided to hand over to him all the letters that Thoreau had written, as well as the daguerreotype and some very important historical books. Greene was grateful just to have another close friend through correspondence, but apparently Jones also became enamored of Greene, for he wrote in a letter once, "I wish you could visit us again just to see Mr. Greene. He is worthy of the letters that Thoreau sent him. I could gladly lick the dust off his shoes. He is old and poor, but great God, what a man." Jones and Greene continued to exchange books and articles and other Thoreau materials by mail, and Jones began to prepare the letters that Thoreau had sent Greene for publication in a book, which eventually became Some Unpublished Letters of Henry D. and Sophia E. Thoreau, published in 1899. Jones had planned to give all of his Thoreau material to the University of Michigan for what would be called the Concord Room. It was a room that would be added during a proposed expansion of the U of M library. However, plans for that wonderful room fell through, and subsequently, Jones's Thoreau material, much of it from Calvin Greene, was scattered to the four winds. Here's just a partial list of places that Greene's things have turned up so far: the National Portrait Gallery, Princeton, University of Illinois, the Concord Free Library, the Huntington Library, the Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society, the University of Michigan, and private ownership. Tracking down all the things that belong to Greene has been a fun and interesting project. Each item has such an interesting story attached to it. Just to take one example, perhaps the most famous, the Maxim daguerreotype that Greene had through a tape was given to Jones in 1897, but because U of M backed out of that plan for making a new Concord room in their library, Jones was sort of miffed at them and he decided not to give him his things. So instead, when he died in 1912, his collections passed to his son, P.V.B. Jones, who became a history professor at the University of Illinois. P.V.B. Jones then apparently sold the most valuable items to the rare book dealer Alexander Greene of Chicago, no relation, which included this daguerreotype. So Alexander Greene, the bookseller, tries selling the daguerreotype along with lots of other materials he's received from Jones to Middlebury College. And it seemed like it would happen for a minute. The plan fell through, and then the daguerreotype was lost for many, many, many years. It then turned up again when a Vermont dealer in daguerreotypes suddenly realized what it was they had tucked away in their shop. So the shop owners had picked up daguerreotypes from all over the place, and they had no idea where they'd acquired it from. But once they realized its value, they put it up for sale in 1972 in an auction in New York, and it sold to Thoreau collector Robert Rowland Miller for $2,000, which was the highest price that a purchaser had ever paid for a daguerreotype up to that point. Miller then sold it several months later for $4,000 to the National Portrait Gallery of Washington, D.C., and that is where it resides today. Greene died on October 30th, 1898, peacefully in his sleep. His wife went to wake him after a nap, after his noon meal, and he did not wake. He'd been healthy and energetic right up to the point of his death, writing letters just days before he passed away, saying he felt that he still had a good long time to live. He was buried in Mount Avon Cemetery, and his wife Esther was buried beside him 2 years later. The Rochester Era newspaper wrote in his obituary, "He was a kindly, thoughtful man, loving his books, authors, friends, and home, and those who knew him best thought the most of him. With his peculiar strength and independence of soul, he was a marked personage among the few who would give themselves the trouble to understand him. His literary merit and culture is shown by the fact of his having associated himself personally and by correspondence with such men as Thoreau, Emerson, Alcott, Bennett, Hosmer, and MacDonald. He cared more for truth than for creeds. He was an abolitionist when it was considered a disgrace to be one. His unwavering earnestness and sincerity always placed him on the side of the afflicted and oppressed." Another beautiful memorial was printed in his favorite magazine, The Truth Seeker, giving us the best picture I've yet found of who Greene was. By birth, Mr. Greene was a New York State man, but in thought and affiliation, he was one of the New England abolitionists and reformers of thought and deed who have made an indelible impression upon the world. Of a very modest disposition, he has not been heard of by very many. He has not been heard of by the public to any extent. But he was one of the pioneer workers for free thought, for the abolition of Negro slavery, and a firm believer in what he called the facts of spiritualism. His letters reveal a noble and gentle mind, serene and high thoughts, and an affectionate and sympathetic nature. Mr. Greene was a much larger man than his neighbors knew. To them, he was a kindly old gentleman. To his intimates intellectually, he was a guide and philosopher, a pioneer to the heights, a leader in the army of progress. His sympathetic nature made him a friend to all reformers, and he loved them and was affected by their fortunes, though he never saw them. Which brings me back to where I began, at the southwest corner of Avon and Rivernoy Roads, As part of my research into Calvin Greene's life, I decided to make my own sort of literary pilgrimage here to the land where Calvin Greene had once dreamed and probably played his flute. Now, how had all of this not become a parking lot or a suburban housing development, I wondered with some astonishment as I walked around that first day about a year and a half ago, struck by the beauty of the place. When I inquired about its history at Rochester Hills City Hall, which is the building that sits in the center of this piece of land, I was shown a file that contained a new and very interesting part of the story. A Rochester resident and at the time Oakland University student named Tim Smart grew up near this land and came to love those woods and hills and the riverbank. He referred to the wooded hills to the southwest as the Highlands and the floodplain around the Clinton as the Lowlands. Now, never knowing about Calvin Greene or the old mill, Tim had been of the same spirit as him. He had read and deeply appreciated Thoreau, and he began writing his own compositions about the land in a style that called Thoreau to mind. To think that 100 years had passed, and another young man was having these same Thoreauvian thoughts as Calvin Greene, being enchanted by the same bend in the Clinton River. And now here I was in the year 2019, down at the riverbank with my own copy of Thoreau in my journal, carrying on this kind of tradition. I was so grateful that this place has continued to exist, and I fully believe that Greene would have been so happy to hear the later history of what was once his land. Now, Greene's story began for me as one of good books, inspiring ideas and friendships. But when I learned about the mill property, it also became a story about love for the land and ecology and activism and resilience. Because when Tim Smart learned about the planned development of the Highlands, he decided to do what he could to stop it from happening and to protect the place that had become sacred to him. The story appeared many times in local newspapers in the mid-1970s. Tim is now a retired teacher living in California, and I am honored to have him here with us tonight. So as I close this story of Calvin Greene, he can share some of his own words about the place where Calvin Greene once lived.
So thank you, Dean, and thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tim Smart. I grew up on a street called Avon Circle that was less than a mile from where Greene lived, corresponding with Thoreau more than 100 years before my time. Back in the 1960s, around my home, roads like Avon and Livernois were made of packed dirt, and they were undulating, and in many places they threaded like tunnels under the overhanging branches of oak trees. I was raised by parents and grandparents to appreciate nature. I still have a trove of books from my grandparents, Peterson Field Guides, Audubon Guides, a book on Michigan wildflowers from my grandparents. And I inherited my father's copy of Walden. So I began reading Thoreau in junior high, specifically this book, In Wildness is the Preservation of the World. So reading books like these, Thoreau became my idol, my messiah, leading me toward a simple life with nature. But there was something else valuable that I grew up with, a place that my best friend and I called the Pasture. It was maybe 200 acres of wild and semi-wild land. It encompassed all of Calvin Greene's property and beyond. There were two main parts of the pasture, a peninsula of raised land that my friend and I named the Highlands, and the Clinton River floodplain we called the Lowlands. Yet after the Huron-Clinton interceptor sewer line was gouged through the lowlands in the early 1970s, gutting it, the Highlands became my personal haven, my refuge, my Walden Pond. I hiked there, camped there, listened there, and learned there. I used dichotomous keys from my grandparents' field guides to identify the plants of the Highlands. I colored the black and white sketches in my grandparents' wildflower books such as this trout lily, while sitting next to the living specimens in the highlands. And after a hike or a sleepover under the moon or stars of the oak trees, I'd come home, sit at my desk, and write my ruminations. After high school, I gathered many of these short writings into this collection that I called Notes afield and Expansions Thereof. And it seems antiquated now, but in my nature writing, I endeavor to emulate Thoreau's writing with phrases like, was afforded an exquisite view of the full moon, or now see the snow alight so softly on the herbage of the field. But in all this time growing up, in all this luxuriating I'd done in nature, I was utterly naive about one important reality. The Rochester area where I lived was booming with development, subdivision after subdivision, strip mall after industrial park. It never occurred to me that the highlands, my Walden Pond, an undeveloped jewel perched on a bluff overlooking an increasingly busy Avon Road, was actually owned by a person, but it was. That fact struck me like a lance through my heart one spring day in 1977, when I saw a towering sign planted in the highlands facing Avon Road, and it said, "For sale, residential development." Here was another subdivision in the making, promising that packed cookie-cutter houses and sod lawns or stacked condominiums would replace the home since time immemorial of fox and orchids and red oaks and Calvin Greene. I knew the change could happen fast because money motivates. The only way I knew to fight was to write. And so, even though I was only a student at Oakland that year, I did what I could to preserve the highlands by writing a dozen or so letters. I wrote to nature organizations, the Avon Township Supervisor and Planning Commission, the property owner, Oakland University professors, the Rochester branch of the Women's National Farm and Garden Association, the Rochester-Avon Recreation Authority, and other groups. I extolled the wonders of the highlands, its blueberry bogs, wildlife, rare plants, and deep shaded woodlands. I asserted the highlands should be kept as a nature preserve for all to enjoy, where nature could flourish, as so precious little of it remained in Avon Township. In response to my letters, a team from the Michigan Natural Areas Council made a reconnaissance report on this property, and they were guided by a map I made of the land. Township Hall in the highlands.
Tim, I think your mic cut out for just a moment. Would you mind repeating right after you had pulled out your map? You said the map I made. I think it kind of cut out audio-wise for a moment.
Okay, so I heard from a newspaper reporter after all those letters, and I heard from supportive neighbors who had read about my efforts in the press. But most consequential of all, I heard back from Avon Township. They wanted to purchase the property to build a new township hall on the highlands. Soon afterwards, I was invited to meet one-on-one with Township Supervisor Earl Borden at his home. And based on my letters, he expressed interest in having a park with a nature trail on the property. And he was excited to design the new township hall so as to blend in with the natural elements of the highlands that I wrote to him about. And that's what came to pass. So although I didn't know it at the time, I was caught up in the silver thread of history. much like the Clinton River that weaves through the lowlands. Thoreau, my Messiah, and I have been stitched together through the story of Calvin Greene, who lived in Avon and loved nature there as I once did. It's a tale told to me by a new generation of natural historians like Dean Masters, who comes to the highlands to observe her and preserve her. So I thank you, Dean, and now it's back to you.
Thanks. So with this, we're going to wrap up the talk, and I'm happy to take questions. I hope if you've had questions, you put them in the chat. And I will say that I'm not the expert on Rochester and local history. I've been learning quite a bit through this project, so I'm sure you'll stump me with many, many questions. And I'd be happy to research and try to find the answers and follow up with you on anything that I don't know.
All right, if you're ready to take questions.
Yeah.
Great. I didn't know if you had one more slide because it said you were on 75 of 76. Oh, just your acknowledgement.
Yes, I do. Thank you. I'll just throw up the acknowledgements, but I appreciate that.
I know we got at least one question, and if anybody has a question, feel free to go ahead and ask away right now. But until then, I can ask. Dominique asks, what do we know about Greene's friends and connections in Rochester, such as in the Literary Society? And they also inquired about the population of Rochester in the 1860s to 70s, which somebody actually did give a resource. They said you can look up all population numbers through community profiles at semcog.org. So if you're interested in that, please use that. But to restate the other question, what do we know about Greene's friends and connections in Rochester, such as in the Literary Society?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for the link about the population, because I will use that myself to learn. As far as Greene's connections in Rochester, this is an area that I'm still curious about myself. I've spent some time trying to prove to myself that Fidelia and Gillette and Greene knew each other and may have been close. But yeah, so as far as other members of the Literary Society, I have yet to sort of trace the life of the Literary Society from when it began and who was maybe included. But that's an interesting project. I hope to learn more about that.
That's very interesting. And Tim, I actually did want to ask a quick question to you because you're also still on the line here. Because you had mentioned that you were familiar with Thoreau, and that's part of kind of what gave you this kind of closeness and appreciation for nature. At what point down the line did you familiarize yourself with the story of Calvin Greene? It seems like you kind of coincidentally happened upon this connection.
Yeah, thanks for asking. That was 6 months ago when Dean reached out to me. He tracked me down in a circuitous way, and I received an email. I didn't open it because I was suspicious of somebody that I didn't know, but the URL was Oakland University. Obviously, it was my alma mater, so I thought, well, maybe this is safe to open. And I had never heard of Calvin before, and it certainly was an eye-opener and really brought me back to my own efforts and my former life. And it's just been really exciting to be in touch with Dean and learn what many of you have learned tonight. So it's been a pleasure.
That's a really fantastic one of those the world being smaller than we think of it moments. I also wanted to come back to Dean and ask a question while we're waiting and see if there's any other questions from anyone else. This story, I think, I'm curious if you feel this story of this kind of like not pen pal exactly, but this sort of like connection of these disparate people across the country. Does it ring to you as becoming kind of more even relevant as time goes on? Because I know there are a lot of people who connect now, like obviously in the internet age, in ways like this. It's kind of fascinating to see something like a sort of early like prototype of that, like these people connecting through these shared works. So I guess that's what I want to ask is like, do you feel like with the story of Calvin Greene that we're finding this story to become more relevant, and in what ways do you think what we're seeing in this story with Greene and his family, as well as Thoreau himself, is kind of like different from now and yet, or similar rather?
I'll try to take that question on. As far as the similarities and differences between our time and Calvin Greene's time, I mean, part of the fun in doing this sort of historical research is finding those similarities and realizing that despite the fact that 160 years has passed, many of the values that people had and many of the kinds of things that were important to them haven't changed. And I really do think sometimes that I wonder, would Greene, if he was standing here, would he have observed it the same way or had the same kind of thought about it? And I'm sure he himself at the time was thinking the same thing about Thoreau and so on. Between the correspondence that's part of the story and part of so many historical projects, the correspondence and the passing back and forth of books, and that it's a way that people were able to be together over great distances and share ideas in ways we often take for granted how easily we can do that now and how quickly. But the fact that those things were going on, and in many cases, like we're going through a period where we've all been very isolated, and the value of communication and feeling togetherness over big spaces has become so important. So it's neat to see how I think of Calvin Greene's letters with his brother and how sort of lost he felt and all that, and that feeling of connection to home through reading a book together and talking about it, and then sharing ideas through letters has a parallel in the ways that we've tried to do the same thing today. So
I think it's a really wonderful thought, and we did just get a couple more questions. Before that, I wanted to shout this out because I had noted it earlier and forgot to mention, but Corinne and Maureen both wanted to give you thanks for shouting out their respective books. One for Of Westward I Go Free, and then also from Maureen, and they praised your presentation. But to move on to our recent questions, we also have a note from Patrick that the city of Rochester Hills has preserved 100 acres surrounding City Hall, which is welcome to be walked and experienced. So similar to how that, nature has been preserved, like that kind of work is carrying on, which is really great. And we got a question from Glenn, who is curious. He wants to know if you know any more on his abolitionist activity referenced in those letters. So he mentions here anything like relevant to someone like John Brown or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's an area of Greene's life that I want to learn quite a bit more about. We have those glimpses from his obituaries, and the fact that he attended Oberlin and that his father was, listed as being an abolitionist, and Greene himself. As far as in the letters that I've been able to turn up so far, he doesn't speak explicitly about it, but he does say in one of his letters to Thoreau, when he writes asking for the lecture about John Brown, he makes a big point to write out John Brown's name with some heavy underlining, and he says the hero underlined, and it comes as a surprise to me that Greene was so involved with John Brown's campaign and was sort of communicating with Thoreau about it at the time. Because it's surprising to me what connections there are to people even where I was Michigan with that story. So, as far as I also see a question regarding Calvin Greene's home and mill, and I'll respond to that. That's yet again another mystery that I've been trying to solve in frequent trips to the mill property. The first task has been trying to locate the exact spot where the building may have been. My close friend Don and I have been traipsing around in the woods and around the creek bed looking for any sign of the course of the two creeks that I theorize may have powered the mill have changed somewhat significantly over the years, whereas the actual shape of the Clinton River hasn't changed too much, other than when the road was reconstructed at that intersection. As far as his home goes, I believe that he lived on the east side of the river, and there have been some more modern houses that were built in that area. Most recently, there were two houses sort of side by side on the east side of Clinton, right there on Livernois Road, and both are since gone. And there is a canoe launch point there now and a parking area. And I've suspected for a while that the parking area right next to that canoe launch may have been the site of Greene's house, where this literary gathering happened and all that. But I still haven't confirmed that. And yes, I don't recall off the top of my head, but the question is the mining camps and towns that Harvard was in. Those are the places that he writes his letters from. Yeah, I'd have to pull up my notes to be able to answer that question, unfortunately. But I can certainly follow up and send an email if you're still curious about that.
But we do have some notes on that based on.
Yeah. There's a record of see the way that we have Harvard Greene's letters is sort of we don't have the letters themselves, unfortunately. Calvin Greene kept about 70 of them and they've disappeared. I don't know if a descendant of Greene's may still have them. I do know that Calvin Greene's diary has survived at least until 2008. John Rosemurgy, who was a resident of Rochester, worked on Calvin Greene's story for a long time. And in fact, most of his life, he was aware of that story. He turned 100 years old just last year, and he's really excited to see that someone's carrying on the Greene research and story. And he had spoken with a descendant of Calvin Greene in 2008, and that person still had Calvin Greene's diary, which was really surprising to me. And so it's possible there are more letters out there to be discovered and diaries and so on. But Harvard Greene's letters, I only know of them because they were quoted when Calvin Greene was writing to Samuel Arthur Jones in Ann Arbor. He, as part of their correspondence, he quoted large chunks of his brother's letters to Jones. So that's how we get a picture of what Harvard Greene was doing in California and all of that.
Excellent. I think I want to ask another question of Tim real quick. I was wondering, you've discovered this kind of connection to Calvin Greene and therefore like another degree of Thoreau, another degree of closeness to Thoreau beyond how you might have resonated with his work. Has it changed? Like, in what ways has your, I guess, connection or maybe your perspective on Thoreau's work changed, having discovered this kind of like similarity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will let you know that this year my life is sort of on hold because though the Calvin Greene story has entered my life through Dean and Dean as well, I was asked, I say I'm a retired teacher, but I'm actually still teaching because some families of former students asked me to tutor their children in these god-awful times of online learning. So I've been doing subjects and multiple subjects with multiple grade levels, and doing a lot of cramming of reading ahead, a few hours ahead of a lesson, and doing lesson planning. And a lot of these things that I'm inspired to go into through my connections with Dean are sort of waiting for my retirement this summer. But I do want to read. I have more books of Thoreau on my bookshelf that I have not gotten to in all these years. And more to your question, Joe, what I like about this story is just it's a confirmation that Henry David Thoreau was as much of a sort of hermit that he was, and an introvert. He did have a warmth of heart, and did reach out to others far away from his town, people whom he had not seen and just knows through writings, again, beyond his close circle in Concord. So I think that's exciting, and that makes me feel all the closer to Thoreau that, I too could have been among those people 100 years that he may have replied to, and it just makes him more human, more accessible, more personal to me, hearing this story with Calvin Greene. So
I agree. It's a very human moment. I think it really does give you a different perspective on this kind of grander literary figure. I don't see any other questions, so I think I'll ask one final question, and I think I'll ask it of Dean, because you mentioned a lot about getting these some of these letters and kind of more personal items, and a lot of these primary sources that are a little more maybe obscure or a little more personal. I was curious, like, what kind of experience do you have, or what kind of process do you go about getting access to some of these sources that aren't maybe as readily available as just, finding a book or something along those lines?
Well, it helps that I have worked in a library for most of my working life in various libraries. And so having some research skills and navigating libraries is a big thing. I've become, having said that, I've learned about archives as though I have never worked in libraries before in the last year and a half. I had no idea even what was happening downstairs in our archives to some extent until I started familiarizing myself with the Rod and Sue Wilson collection that Oakland University just obtained. And it's been so fun to learn how to research as part of this. And the people who, some of the people here listed in acknowledgements, and some I'm sure aren't listed there, have been so helpful. I could go through a whole list of historians and people that have given me tips, and I think probably especially Debbie Larson has been the most helpful in like kind of really knowing Rochester history better than anybody I've met, and and so it's wonderful to get an education is really what the whole thing is for me, both of the historical materials and how to do this kind of research. I've met archivists from universities all over the country now, and editors and people I would not have expected to meet. It's been very a wonderful experience.
Excellent, and we are grateful that you've had all these experiences. We got to learn a lot of wonderful stuff tonight. Lots of echoes of the past. The Echoes Amid the Oaks title really plays into this kind of cyclical story here, and it's really interesting. I think with that, we will go ahead and call it an evening. I would like to ask quickly if Tim or Dean, if either of you have any final comments you wanted to make before we truly end this presentation.
Yeah, let me just say thank you everyone for attending and spending this evening with us. It's really wonderful to see people show up and be curious about this.
Excellent. Tim, anything from you?
Well, no, I think, Joe, you put it that this is not a be-all, end-all presentation, that it goes on. And I would look forward to being part of something in the future as the more revelations are made of Calvin and his relationship with Thoreau and with the land of Rochester. So we'll do it again.
That's excellent. I'm glad to hear from both of you. So thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Dean. And thank you to everyone who attended tonight. We're glad to spend this time with you, and we hope you had a wonderful time during this presentation. With that, I'll go ahead and say good night, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you for joining us.